I love that word. I want to offer a provocation. So this morning, I feel like Dr. Rodriguez gave us some really important research. And of course, every researcher will tell you we need more research. But I would say until we really have a sense of what are the range of workers' experience in these new worlds of work, that we're rushing too quickly to define a problem. So the provocation I want to offer is connecting this morning's talk and thinking about some of the hopefully productive tension from this afternoon's conversation, panel conversation, to tie together a way of rethinking what is the problem that we're trying to solve. So my co-author Siddharth Suri and I coined the term ghost work to be such a provocation, to ask all of us to rethink what it is we imagine we are building when we talk about platform economies. The first place I should start is defining ghost work. In a superficial way, it's describing particular kinds of work, but in other ways, it's a much deeper concept. It's meant to say we're not talking about niche jobs that are eventually going to go away when the robots arrive or are in very specific sectors. We're actually describing arguably the dismantlement of full-time employment through a very specific mechanism that connects the work that a Glovo writer does to the work of people who are cleaning data to model artificial intelligence. I'm going to explain what I mean by that last term. But importantly, we're describing the labor conditions that can come with failing to see and perhaps actively devaluing the role of people in platform economies when people are coming to serve us to produce information for a consumer, whether the consumer is a business or you and me. So let me make this a little bit more concrete. When I say there's a specific mechanism, literally back in the early 2000s, computer scientists and engineers worked out a way that they could have software not just execute a task with software alone, but to call a person to a moment of decision making that was really beyond artificial intelligence. And they built this mechanism, it's called human computation, to effectively be able to match businesses, an engineer, anyone, to a platform with a request. So think of them as the demand side of this market. And they could put this request on a platform that really is nothing fancy, it's just software. I think it's actually really important for us to realize we're not talking about menacing automated mechanisms. We're really just talking about software that's sophisticated, but nothing that's not already in your computers today. So you can put it on a platform and use what are called application programming interfaces and the internet, and you can basically call people to pick up the task. So just think of that abstraction, to be able to create a way to have a moment of judgment from a person brought into a task you're trying to complete. But the important thing that I think is often lost in this conversation is that all of these labor markets that build around this mechanism don't rely on matching one person to another person. Their value is that they aggregate lots of people to be available. So their value is both that they can offer you a person who can complete your task, but just as importantly, there are many people available to you to complete a task. Please hold that in mind, because it's one of the things I think we often let fall out of our way of seeing this world. So any task that can be at least be sourced in some way, so you're finding somebody to do the work, managed, shipped, scheduled, and billed through an application programming interface, an API, and the internet is ripe for this kind of economy. That's what makes it something that goes well beyond a niche job. And in fact, one way to think about this is that right now you can see a world of online to offline platform jobs. So things like Deliveroo, Uber, Glovo. All of those are visible to us, and in many ways that's what's galvanizing our political conversations to do something, because we can see the worker who might be in duress, who might have different feelings about the work that they're doing, but importantly, all these platforms have different relationships with the labor forces they've created. They have one thing in common: they're using this mechanism of human computation to manage that two-sided market, right? There's another world of work that most of us didn't realize was going on in the background. So 2 years ago, if I said content moderation was actually a job that somebody did, how many of you would have known that to be true? That we literally are only now coming to realize how dependent tech companies, other companies that have any user-generated content, material that you and I put on the internet, requires some sort of curation, some sort of review. And companies rely on these content moderators to be that moment of a person stepping into the computational loop, reviewing some sort of information, making a snap decision, and then moving it forward so that an automated process can pull information down, move it to another location, send it to more people for review. It's a marvelous system. It's a fascinating system. But what you mostly miss is this growing world of on-demand work that's online to online work, where you never see it touch down, much like content moderation, that's building out through all of these companies. And this is just a small sample of the number of companies that are using crowds of people called to a platform to process data. So keep in mind, when anytime we hear the phrase big data, it's all of the data we're creating online all the time, or all the data we create when we go into a doctor's office. That is the store of big data that companies are trying to figure out, how do I make use of that? How do I help consumers? How do I use that to somehow benefit society? It's not inherently bad or good, but a lot of it's messy. And so these companies that are mostly doing data analytics, that looks like data labeling, other forms of what are basically two streams of work to create some value out of piles and piles of data. That's a world of work that most of us never see, because many of the people doing that work are doing it per task, often at home, or in settings where they're on contract for 2 weeks, 2 months. It depends on the project. So it's an incredibly contingent form of work. We use the term, the paradox of automation's last mile, to describe this process of having basically two streams of work that are being produced by this mechanism of human computation. One is the stream that sometimes we hear about, that's basically people training artificial intelligence. So Alexa, Google, Cortana, Siri, am I leaving any of them out? All of them rely on having people hired to be able to review all of that data to help it be clear enough for software to model how would it automate what you might ask for next. It's a quite impressive engineering feat, but it's not magic. It's just software. And of course it requires hiring people. So we shouldn't be shocked when we hear that a tech company is using all of the data that we're creating and hiring people to make sense of it. Because in fact, most of the time our data just doesn't make a lot of sense out of context. So people are hired to bring in that context. Sometimes they're just fixing typos. That second stream of data is the one that I want you to really track. Because increasingly businesses that want to offer some form of artificial intelligence are offering a service, say calendar scheduling. And at the end of the day, they might get 60% of that correct. But what they can always do is hire a person to look at a piece of information, just the task, look at this information, and have them make a quick decision and have your experience move on without you ever knowing a person was in the loop. It's a business. It's a thriving, growing business-to-business sector that involves bringing people into a moment of task completion. It doesn't have to be a bad job. And that's actually the message of this book. is that we're at a moment where we have to be mindful that we have an opportunity to make a new set of rules around doing task-based, project-driven work. So in some ways, to get there is to think about how much this is a continuation of a story. And this is really my link to Sarah's work. We've been here before. We've seen moments where particular bodies, women's bodies often, were thought of as available enough, cheap enough to throw at problems that technology could not solve yet. And it was always that promise of someday we're going to figure out how to build a machine that can completely finish a shirt. So this is a shot of a moment in piecework in the beginning of the industrial era in Massachusetts, of women around a farm table and their children, and men also participated in this work on farms, to be able to put the final flourish, the button, the bow, on a shirt, because it was too delicate to be able to have it sewn on by a machine. It took a good 40 years to get this kind of piecework out of manufacturing in the best manufacturing centers. Piecework still exists today. So clearly technology never finished the job. It never made it the last mile. But we've always had people in the mix. And the question is, why didn't we value what they were doing? Why didn't we value who they were? That was true for the space programs in the United States. So many of you might have heard of the film Hidden Figures. The women who were hired to do computing, who were actually called computers, were doing work on federal contracts. And so they could be dismissed as soon as a project was over. None of these women who were pivotal to sending astronauts into space had formal employment. They were all working on projects. And eventually some of them did get formal employment, but it wasn't a matter of evaluating, were they doing something worthless? No, they were doing something quite important that, yes, was displaced, that particular function, by technology. But in the moment, we didn't have rules around how to value them and what they were doing, arguably. Then the 60s, again, a very particular face comes to the fore of who's seen as an available but cheap form of contingent labor. And by this point in history, it's not that far off from using methods of the internet and other sorts of infrastructure to move work that more or less is the same office work that was done down the hall to another side of the country or another side of the world. So the growth of business process outsourcing is in some ways just the very glimmer of platform economies, where you have the capacity to move things that are project-based, that are likely only going to last a few months or a few years, you don't know. It's a business speculating on what do I need? And it's not an investment in a long-term employment relationship. It is literally, I need groups of people now who have the capacity to help me. Where can I find the labor for that? So think about ghost work as the collision, in some ways, the conversation we've been delaying for more than a century, to really think about what it means to have social safety nets that aren't about an assembly line, that literally have to contend with, what about people who are working outside of a factory? To be able to think about, there might be creative, professional communities that also need support for their work, that they can't necessarily fend for themselves. But we also weren't tracking the rise of the use of contingent labor and global supply chains that effectively are why so many multinational companies, well, that might have been a Freudian slip, have so much concentration of power and wealth. Because they were able to move their operations through supply chains that built out their capacity to do the work that they do without having to incur the local costs in the global north of labor. And then lastly, and most importantly, and we're not too far yet into this, the 2000s are a shift towards service economies. We, as I've been saying throughout the day, and I think somebody else had said it earlier, today, as consumers, we buy more experiences than things. We are driven by a service economy, whether that's in health, retail, sales. But the reality is most of our jobs are not about manufacturing, in some ways because AI can figure out manufacturing. There's one technical reason it's really good at doing that, because everything about a manufacturing environment can actually be built to be locked in as a closed system. So what's fascinating about this world of work is it's all about delivering a human response. We've literally built most of what we can technically to be able to do the yes and no that software is very good at doing. And we're leaving ourselves with a world of service work that requires a human touch. And what humans bring to most jobs, creativity and the capacity to really have complex communication, those are the two areas where computer scientists argue it's the most challenging place to technically automate. Like, that's pretty profound. We've literally automated our way into our humanity, what we have left to offer, which is ourselves, like to serve each other. That's the work we do. So, to study people's experiences of living in an information service economy, we had to go big. We took thousands of surveys. We interviewed more than 200 people. We did field work, so literally I sat in people's houses, in their offices, in the cafes they went to be able to see what their world looked like when they weren't working. We did some behavioral experiments to understand what motivated people to stay in these economies and why they left. And we looked at the transaction data of 4 different companies that we studied. And we studied companies that would stand in for this large swath of business approaches that cross sectors. So whether it's Amazon Mechanical Turk, which might be familiar to many of you, or Universal Human Relevance System, which is Microsoft's internal crowdsourcing platform, which you will never see, and every tech company has. And it has thousands and thousands of projects that people are doing every single hour. Or 2 other companies that I think show a different way forward. So one is a social entrepreneurship called Lead Genius that literally takes information off the web and creates sales leads for sales teams. It's a very practical business-to-business need. And it turns out people are much better at figuring out who should you call when you're trying to sell somebody an air conditioner than just trusting the web to have that answer. And then the second that I think is even more fascinating is Amara. It's a translation and captioning site that started out as a volunteer community for language access for the deaf and hard of hearing. And then companies started coming to them and saying, can we just pay you to translate and caption our videos because we need them done quickly? Captioning and translation are actually really hard to automate. Because if you think about trying to capture a live video of somebody speaking in Catalan and Spanish and mixing the two, you really need somebody's expertise to interpret that. So it's not something that's going away anytime soon. All 4 of these companies gave us some access to what it looked like to have the churn of their projects and tasks moving through their platforms. So, why study one country? We studied the United States and India. And what's interesting about studying them is it brings to the fore Luis's point that this is a global supply chain. This is a global labor market, particularly for information services. It's not happening in one country. And actually what's fascinating, and the Catalan example is a good one, it will touch down in some countries because you need to localize information, you need to make it relevant, you need to make sure the language is accurate, the cultural references are accurate, but you also have tons of information services, data management and labeling that can happen anywhere as long as somebody has the language skill that you're hiring in. So what did we find? I'm going to move through just a couple of examples so that we can get to some conversation. This is, to me, one of the key takeaways. And it's sort of like that old, maybe tired description of having many hands on an elephant and not realizing what you're touching, right? There are a good 10% of workers across all these platforms that we call always on who literally turn this into full-time income streams, whatever that means for them. And that means something different for somebody in India versus someone in the United States, but not as different as you'd think. Every one of these platforms relied heavily on this concentrated core of people who had decided, this is what I want to do, or this is what I need to do, because this is what fits with my other demands on my time. But just as importantly, there were a good 20% who we call regulars, who had picked a few hours a week, some sort of schedule that met other commitments in their lives, and they are the deep bench of expertise. That means anytime somebody goes to that platform, if those always-on folks have stepped away, a regular can step in, and you will never know the difference. So, think of any experience you might have had with a platform company where you might have one person one day, another person the next. You don't need to know whether there's somebody who's committed to making this a form of steady income, or if they've decided to make it something they do a few hours a week. What you need is that they can do what you need them to do. So that is really something to hold on to, because there is no way for those folks who are regulars to become full-time, always-on workers. And I'm going to come to that point in a moment. And just as importantly, most of the people on these platforms are picking up 2 or 3 tasks. They try it out. Sometimes they're like, peace out, this is awful, I'm leaving. Other times they have other motivations to move on to other work. We met many people who left who just said, I wanted to try other platforms. That 70% feed into the regulars. They're the ones who become always on. There's no way to cut them entirely out without cutting off the growth of this labor market. So that also means they have incredibly different ideas about what their work means. And this is really important, because there's no way to consolidate what does a worker want or need, because you have different kinds of workers in this labor market. And they are all differently but equally important and valuable. We have never had a form of employment like this, right? We've never had a form of employment where you could walk into an office and have a person who worked for 1 hour and they're just as important as somebody who works for 10. This is the labor market that tells us we have to value people equally if they're there. And if you ask people, what do you do? Well, they might say, I work for a startup, I'm an entrepreneur, I literally am hiring other people who will do work with me, and I source those jobs for them. I'm self-employed. I'm not always sure of the difference between the second and third description. The most important thing to take away here, they all worked on the same platform, and they all did the same kinds of tasks. So there's no way to survey this group and find out, what's your work experience? How do you identify? That's why we can't measure this with the traditional economic methods that we have relied on in the past. So the other really important takeaway, people might be asked to be as isolated as possible and lonely as possible on these platforms. They might have their work atomized for them, but one of the first things they do if they dig into this work and become either an always-oner or a regular is they connect with other people who do this work. They go online, they go on forums, they search the web for who else is doing this kind of work. And what you're looking at is a social network map of all the different sub-communities of just one of those platforms. There's no reason they need different communities, but as all of us know who work in an office, you form different communities in your office. You might go to the bar with one group, you'll go to a restaurant with another group. They're doing the same thing. And literally they hang out in Skype channels together, they text each other, they send each other birthday cards. So they're recreating all of the social needs that we have for working with others. So when you hear somebody talk about firing up the computer and working all night and having somebody keep them company, that's real company for them. That's meaningful for them. That's a colleague for them. And it raises this question, why would you do this work where you have to work so hard to have colleagues or to find work in the first place? And I think we should all stop asking that question and ask, what are the other opportunities available in somebody's life when they move to this kind of work? Because it's not quite fair to call it about flexibility. This is not a easy breezy, I'm making fun choices kind of scene here. It's literally people who are trying to control their time Often, particularly for women, it's about needing to manage home schedules of childcare and elder care. And as our world ages, that's going to be even more true for more of us, that we're navigating our work schedules around our responsibilities to family. They were also trying to control projects, and this is key, that particularly for this generation coming up, the idea of having somebody else tell you what you should do, we've grown up with the idea that that's infringing on a certain right to make choices about what we do. And we might think that's nice, you know, we'd all love to have choices. We literally have a generation that are coming up who absolutely want to prioritize doing projects they care about. That makes sense considering, as a sociologist Gina Neff has argued, we've also reached the point where there really aren't the kinds of full-time, long-term career positions that people would have walked into 20 years ago. So perhaps a coincidence that you have people now saying, I don't really want a 20-year career. And then lastly, people were trying to control their work environments. And this is also a moment to take stock in what that says about our work environments in formal economies. That means for some of the workers we talked with, they wanted to get out of what they called the office politics of sexual harassment, or having to hold themselves in a particular way if there were people with a disability or had a different identity that they didn't feel they could share at work. So it's a reflection of a kind of marginalization within formal employment, but recognize it is a part of why people move to these platforms. So when someone like Carmela claims that this is a way to experience her best life, she's not talking about the work itself, although she certainly did talk about enjoying doing video captioning and translation work. She's literally talking about being able to find work that gives her a way of prioritizing other things in her life. This is about motivating people who are motivated by organizing their lives so that they don't have to wrap around a work schedule or work expectations set on them. So where do we go from here? If those are the priorities that people have, this is really the demand of our economy today. There's an entire chapter where Sid and I list out a set of fixes. Some of them are technical, some of them are social, and arguably none of them can really be done in isolation from a broader conversation with civil society. But one thing to keep in mind is that there is no single work site, and that there are a list of other realities that have to be part of the conversation when we're thinking about how to move forward in terms of policy. So not just that there's no single work site, but there's literally no sole employer of record. And you could say for online to offline work, we are literally the employers. Very rarely do consumers see themselves in that position, but we are part of an employment relationship in any of these platform economies because of the way the labor market is structured. We are part of calling them to a task and paying them for executing it. So keep in mind that there's not a single employer of record, and often a consumer is part of that employment relationship. There's also no unifying professional identity, and I think about this when I think about your work, that realizing that having a professional identity becomes a toehold on a certain, not just security, but social recognition. And so to not have social identity as a mechanism for collective organizing is a loss that we literally have to account for and rethink what are our ways of organizing in the absence of a really solid, clear professional identity. It won't be data labelers of the world unite. That's nonsensical as a form of identity. So what does that identity look like? And it's globally networked. I mean, there's really not a case of online to online work that doesn't have workers involved from all over the world, because it can. It's as simple as that. So this is not, as Luz was saying before, a local issue or a global issue. It literally ties local and global together, even for online to offline work. So we need international laws. I know that sounds overwhelming. And at the same time, you can't imagine sister city projects that could start setting up experiments that set some foundation for how could we manage these workforces. How can we provide at the municipal level what people will need to participate in a global economy? What could that look like? I think cities actually could do quite a bit. And then we need new economic models, and I'm going to finish on this point, that in some ways also call out labor arbitrage. I would say that we've literally let 100 years go by where we've let the idea of finding cheap labor somewhere else live as a business model, and it's awfully hard to justify in an economy that is literally built around, I need as many people available, I don't actually need to worry about where they are. There isn't a market mechanism for pricing that. So arguably, we don't have an economic model yet for how to think about valuing a shared abundance of people making themselves available to us. That is the value proposition. It's a commons, and that's the point we end on in the book, is to think about this not as raw material. This is not raw material for corporate largesse. This is a commons, and this picture is from Boston Common in the mid-1800s. It's a commons that literally numbers of companies are drawing from constantly. And 10 years from now, they may be drawing on commons of people for different reasons. They're going to still be valuable as a contingent workforce. So what would it look like, and this is the question I want to perhaps set out to us, what would it look like to literally value a worker, no matter where they work, how often they work, who they work for, to value them as someone who's going to be available to us? Thank you.